everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a pretty provocative question, all based on some really fascinating source material. Is the U.S. Constitution actually always in charge? It's a question that honestly challenges the very foundation of how we think American government works. So let's get right into it.
So, to put it another way, does the Constitution have an off switch? Is there a situation where the normal rules just don't apply? Well, the source material we're exploring today makes a pretty bold argument that for the last 90 plus years, that switch has been flipped on, and it's never been turned off.
Okay, so let's start with what we all think we know, the baseline assumption, the version of American government we all learned about in civics class.
We generally just presume, right, that the U.S. government runs according to the Constitution. It's got three separate co-equal branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And that separation of powers, that's the bedrock. It's the whole idea, designed specifically to prevent any one branch from getting way too powerful. This is our starting point, the system as it's written on paper.
But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. According to the documents we're examining, that entire system was fundamentally changed at a very specific moment in history, a turning point born out of an emergency that created a massive, massive shift in power.
So the story really kicks off in 1917. During World War I, Congress passes this thing called the Trading with the Enemy Act, a law that was only ever meant to be used during wartime. Now, fast forward to 1933. We're in the absolute depths of the Great Depression. A new law, the Emergency Banking Act, takes that old wartime act and, well, it repurposes it. It allows the president to use these powers during any national emergency he declares, even in peacetime. And get this, for 40 years, this huge shift in power pretty much flies under the radar until a special Senate committee finally decides to investigate what happened back in 1973. And what did that committee find? Well, they actually gave a name to the system that had been created: emergency governance. And their definition? Wow, it's kind of chilling. They defined it as a system that allows the executive to rule without reference to normal constitutional processes. I mean, let that sink in. Those aren't a critic's words. Those are Congress's own words. And this chart just illustrates the change so perfectly. The original 1917 Act, it was only triggered by a formal time of war, and it only applied to foreign enemies. But the 1933 amendment, it added this giant loophole, or any other period of national emergency declared by the president. And here's the real kicker. It changed who the law applied to, from foreign enemies to any person within the United States. Just like that, the scope explodes from wartime to peacetime, and from targeting external enemies to targeting domestic citizens. So this brings us to the core piece of evidence presented in our source material. This is the 1973 Senate report, which is basically the Senate investigating the very monster that it helped create. This right here, this is the money quote from that report. After they went through and cataloged all the different powers the president could switch on during a declared emergency, the committee concluded that all of them, taken together, were so vast that they allowed for rule without the Constitution. Again, this isn't some historian making a claim. This is the United States Senate describing the state of its own laws. So just how much power are we really talking about? Well, the committee cataloged every single law on the books that the president could activate just by saying the words national emergency. And they found 470 of them. 470 distinct statutes controlling pretty much every aspect of American life. And how long had this kind of parallel system been active? By the time the Senate report was published in 1973, the committee determined that America had been in a continuous, uninterrupted state of national emergency for 40 years. So the crucial point is this. The Senate's own investigation concluded that a permanent state of emergency, a parallel system of government, had been in place ever since that Emergency Banking Act was passed. The emergency, it seems, never actually ended. So what on earth does this 90-year-old history have to do with today? Well, according to our source, this is the origin story of the modern administrative state. You know, that huge network of federal agencies from the EPA to the SEC that creates and enforces all the regulations that impact our daily lives? Let's just compare the two systems side by side. Under the Constitution, powers are separated. Congress writes the laws, the president enforces them, the courts judge them. Simple. But under administrative law, a single agency can often do all three of those things. It can write the regulations, enforce them, and then adjudicate disputes in its own internal tribunals with no jury.
The source argues that its authority doesn't come from the Constitution's structure, but from this emergency delegation of power. So to sum up the argument from the source material, this entire framework is seen as unconstitutional. Now, it's really important to point out, this is a very specific interpretation. Mainstream legal thought generally argues that the administrative state is a necessary and constitutional evolution for governing a complex modern society. But the source material we're exploring today, it challenges that idea head-on, arguing that it violates the separation of powers, replaces real courts with agency bodies, and is built on a foundation of emergency logic, not constitutional law. And all of this leads to the biggest, most obvious question of all. If there's even a shred of truth to the source's argument, why in the world does this system persist?
Exactly. I mean, we're taught that the Supreme Court is the ultimate referee, right? They decide what's constitutional and what's not. So if this system of emergency governance and administrative law truly bypasses the Constitution, why haven't the courts just struck it all down?
And here it is, the final and frankly the most stunning claim from the source material. The argument is that the courts can't fix the problem because they're part of it. Think of it this way. The same laws that created these agencies also gave the courts the power to hear their cases. So according to this view, a court can't strike down the whole system because that would be like a branch sawing itself off the tree. Its own authority to even hear the case comes from the very system it's being asked to dismantle. It's a complete paradox.
And that just leaves us with this final hanging question. If the one branch of government that's designed to be the constitutional guardian can't or won't rule on the legitimacy of this parallel system, who can? It's a question that really challenges our most basic assumptions about how law and power actually function in the United States today.